Stephen, welcome to the show.
Always great to be on your show, Joel.
I'm going to push back on you, which is unusual.
It's not going to help at best, it'll make things worse at worst. It's going to be incredibly divisive. In actual fact, if you're an Indigenous Australian in custody, you are actually less likely to die.
We are our own tribe, he says. We are our own group of people. I'm voting no because I see it as me ceding my sovereignty under this one voice. I recently had an Australian Associated Press fact check on me. Thank you guys for that.
You're talking about a budget for The Voice in the hundreds of millions.
Is this just a face mask for a communist actual agenda?
The inability of many Indigenous Australians to be able to own their own homes because of rules set over them.
Is that a thing?
Actually, a lot of the people who advocate for this voice just hate Australia. I don't think it's about closing the gap.
Are you meant to either wipe out the Indigenous population or do a treaty with them of sorts?
The question always must be, will this help the worst affected Indigenous Australians? I'm predicting roughly a 60% no.
I want to thank you for your time. God
Thanks
bless
so
you.
much, Joel. Thank you. Appreciate
Cheers.
it.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm a lazy voter. I'm not sure if I'm voting yes, I'm not sure if I'm voting no. Today, to help me navigate through this, because I do have my ballot with me, I've got Dr. Stephen Chavura, who's a fan of the show, who's been a supporter of the show for many years. Absolutely. And fun fact, he's actually one of the first people that started teaching me on Australian politics back in 2018. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Always great to be on your show, Joel.
Welcome guys, I'm Joel Jammal from Turning Point Australia, if you're from Stephen's large and growing audience, especially on TikTok. And as I said, we have the Voice to the Parliament referendum coming up. I have my real ballot with me, mail-in ballot, which I'm going to hand in on person on election day. And this is what question we are being posed with, and Stephen's going to help me through it. It's a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Yes or no? You have to write, and that's what it looks like. Stephen, I'm going to push back on you, which is unusual in this particular interview.
Especially since I haven't said anything yet, but yes.
Indeed, indeed. People have received this in the mail, which shows them the yes and the no proposals, but let's be honest, when was the last time you read a book, guys? Give it to me straight. You're on the no side.
Yes.
Why should people be voting for this?
Why should people be voting
against this?
Against it?
Yes.
Well, two reasons. Number one, it's almost certainly not going to help close the gap of Indigenous disadvantage because it proposes to establish a system that is going to be, in its fullness, very unwieldy. It's going to be an extra layer of bureaucracy on top of the already overburdened bureaucracy that is the Aboriginal industry. So it's at best not going to help alleviate Indigenous disadvantage, and we can explore that a bit more as we go along. At worst, it could actually, and I think probably will actually, make things worse, because I think it'll generate, this voice to Parliament will generate a politics of its own that is going to direct the media's attention away from the actual ways that many Indigenous Australians are disadvantaged and even suffering, and draw it towards just the sensationalistic politics of the voice in Canberra. So that's the first thing. It's not going to help at best, it'll make things worse at worst. Right. Second, it's going to be incredibly divisive because this voice is going to very quickly settle into perpetually calling for a treaty. Right. And that is something that is not going to bring Australians together. It is something that is going to divide Australians. And so the motto of the No campaign, say no to the voice of division, is very accurate.
Right. But everything to this point has failed. You know, we put a lot of money towards this. I'm not sure how much. I do, but I'm not sure how much. It's not getting to the grassroots. We have to do this. I mean, you know, isn't this the best thing we can do to put it in our most founding, you know, biggest document?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, everything we have done has failed. I don't know if I'd completely agree with that. So we know, for example, that alcohol restrictions and alcohol bans in many of the worst affected communities with violence and abuse, that it does actually lower the rates of violence. There is evidence to support all of this. You can read about it in Gary John's book, the burden of culture. It was spoken about sort of 10 years ago by Peter Sutton in his book, The Politics of Suffering. So there are some things that actually do improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. But there are also things that Indigenous Australians have done without the government that have helped. For example, leaving the very regional and remote areas and coming into the areas where there are jobs, where there are good services, where there are schools and people to help in the schools. This has over time increased the standard of living of many Indigenous Australians. We have to keep in mind that it's probably only about 20 to 30% of Indigenous Australians who are in sort of the kind of disadvantage that has made this voice a national issue. The most Indigenous Australians are living well. Now, why are they living well? Well, basically because they've integrated themselves into mainstream Australian culture. Right. So it might be the case that most of the things that the government does don't work, but it doesn't mean that nothing that Indigenous Australians does works. Moving out of the regions and into the built-up areas actually works. Right. So there are things that can be done, and we don't need this voice to do them.
Right. What are we going to do? How is this going to help? I mean, incarceration rates. I mean, it's something that a lot of people are very passionate about. There's the claim out there that Aboriginal people die at higher rates in prison than the other population. I mean, what's the go?
Oh, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Joel, sort of the deaths in custody myth. It is true that Indigenous Australians, like all Australians, can die in custody if they go to prison, but the actual truth is the last study on this done in 2019, and the guy to read on this is Dr. Anthony Dillon, showed that in actual fact, if you're an Indigenous Australian in custody, you are actually less likely to die. Right. So the case is, ladies and gentlemen, that Indigenous Australians in custody are actually less likely to die in custody than non-Indigenous Australians. And even back in the early 90s with the Royal Commission into Indigenous Deaths in Custody, that Royal Commission explicitly said there is no evidence suggesting that Indigenous Australians in custody die at higher rates than non-Indigenous Australians. This whole thing, this idea that there is a crisis of Indigenous deaths in custody, is manufactured purely for the media. Now, it is true that Indigenous Australians are more likely to find themselves in custody, but that is because Indigenous Australians, sadly, are committing more crimes per capita than non-Indigenous Australians. And that is because, to a large extent, you look at these communities, they are very often communities of dysfunction. And that is something that naturally leads to crime. But I don't think the voice to Parliament is really going to fix this.
But Stephen, this is what Aboriginal people are asking for. I mean, you've got the Uluru Statement of the Heart, You've got all the signatories there. I mean, if this is what they're asking for, I mean, who am I to say they shouldn't have it?
Well, I mean, there's everyone's saying, well, not everyone, but a lot of people are saying that 80% of Indigenous Australians want this. So Briggs, in his recent video, says 80% of Indigenous Australians want this. Where do we get this figure of 80%? The figure of 80% goes back to a survey taken in round about February or March in 2023, before the No campaign got going. So before the national debate really took off, and the survey that returned the 80% figure of Indigenous Australians, that was of 300 Indigenous Australians. They surveyed 300 Indigenous Australians and they came back with 80%. That's 300 out of 812,000 self-identified Indigenous Australians. That's where they got the 80% figure from. The other thing is that the survey was conducted, like most surveys, via sort of internet survey databases. Now you have to ask yourself, how many Indigenous Australians in the worst affected communities are members of internet survey databases? Right. So the surveys themselves are sort of dubious in the methodology. But the other thing, Joel, is everyone's saying 80%, 83%. There was another survey around the same time, 83%, with about 700 odd participants, again, online survey based. Has anyone seen the figures of Indigenous support of this voice sort of followed through and tracked over the last 6 months like we've seen non-Indigenous support? Non-Indigenous support has gone from about 65% at the beginning of the year. It's plummeting down to the low 30%.
Yeah.
But everyone keeps saying 80% of Indigenous Australians, 80% of Indigenous. They're not even. They basically got their very high percentage of Indigenous Australians early on in this debate, before the No campaign got going, and they don't want to know whether the opinion has changed at all. You will not find surveys any more recent than about 6 months ago. They're continually quoting the old surveys. They don't care what Indigenous Australians think of this really. They've got their 80%. They're not interested in tracking the opinion because they know that there's a good chance in actual fact that just like non-Indigenous opinion has changed over time, so Indigenous opinion might have changed as well.
So to be clear, those 300 that were in that original survey that came out, one of the first ones, it's most likely that not only were they Aboriginal people living in urban centres, not in the most marginal areas because of the access to internet and all of that, but on top of that, there's a very good chance that they may not even have been Aboriginal, right? Because it was no means tested, it was done online, there's no one checking, which tribe are you part of, the Gadigal tribe? Or?
Well, for the most part in Australia there were no actual tests for Aboriginality, you just tick a box.
You just get tribes to vouch for you, is that how it works then?
Well, it's usually not even that, it's usually you just tick a box, and if someone asks you to sort of demonstrate your Aboriginality, you just call them a racist. I mean, that's to a large extent how it often works. But the important thing is that in actual fact, as of sort of this month, as of the time that this referendum is going to take place, we don't know what the percentage of Indigenous support is because we haven't done a survey of them in months and months.
Right. Maybe I should go out there because we've got a week to go.
Yeah. Interview
some people. But this is this thing, Stephen. I don't fully understand why this is. I interviewed last Saturday Alec Dumaji, who's an Aboriginal man that's voting against the voice. He makes the claim, and you might be able to help me with this, with your understanding of history. He makes the claim that the reason I'm voting no on this isn't because I subscribe to perhaps the colonial traditional view of Australia and our constitution, but I'm voting no because I see it as me ceding my sovereignty under this one voice. We are our own tribe, he says. We are our own group of people. If we're going to have an agreement, we are going to negotiate a treaty. That's what we want. The voice is a way that the Albanese government is trying to use his Aboriginal people to be my voice, which I don't want. I want to keep my sovereignty, and I want to negotiate a treaty for myself. Can you illuminate, us on perhaps the colonial view of this?
Well, I mean, certainly, Indigenous Australia really isn't this single monolithic entity. It is, as your interviewee said, it is hundreds and hundreds of tribes that consider themselves, to use a modern Western term, sovereign. Right. And by sovereign, what they basically mean is no one from any other tribe speaks for that tribe, makes a decision for that tribe. Right. So, that is the kind of sovereignty that he's talking about. And it is necessarily the case that if this voice got up, it would involve tribes being spoken for by Indigenous Australians not from that tribe. It would inevitably happen. The voice to Parliament is not even made up of 30 individuals. And you've got over 250 Indigenous tribes out there. Yeah. And they're only each coming from one tribe, these individuals who make up the voice. And so necessarily it's going to mean that you're going to have tribes being spoken for by people who are not members of their tribes. And this is actually something that the ABC did a story on. Stan Grant wrote a piece defending the voice, and it was actually a very good piece because he was very unbiased. And he pointed out that in his particular community, he interviewed an elder uncle in the community, and the elder uncle said, "We are a tribal people. I will not have anyone from any other tribe speaking for me." So he was very skeptical of the voice because it necessarily meant that a collection of selected Indigenous Australians would form an elite that would then be speaking for everyone else. Yeah. And that is something that many Indigenous Australians are going to have a big issue with, and that is one of the reasons that I think that this voice to Parliament is actually going to lead to a lot of division within among Indigenous Australians. And I think it could actually get pretty ugly as you get these power plays in communities to determine who gets to be the representative of the voice, and it'll be sort of based on tribal allegiances, family allegiances, and things like that. And the other thing is that the Calma-Langton report on the voice, which is we're all supposed to look at to understand it, says quite explicitly that essentially it goes through the whole model, and it makes it very clear that the voice is not necessarily democratically elected. It is not necessarily democratically elected. Some communities...
So selected, not elected.
Selected or appointed are not necessarily democratically elected. And as long as it is not democratically elected, that means that many of Indigenous Australians would have a perfect right to say, it doesn't represent me. And again, I can just see a lot of division, and this is not something I think that is going to lead to unity at all.
Well, see, as a voter, I mean, for me to make a vote on this, you know, some people have made the argument I shouldn't have a vote at all. You know, I'm not Aboriginal. But I thought that if I vote for this sort of thing, I mean, it's not on the proposal of what we're enshrining the Constitution, but I thought that, you know, if the people on this body, the assumption would be that the 3.5% of Aboriginals in this country would have a democratic vote to select who's on this.
Definitely
so that's not the case.
Absolutely not, and the Calma-Langton report makes it very clear. The members of the federal voice are supposed to be elected by the members of what they call the local regional voices, and there are 35 of those voices. And these are bodies, each individual voice is made up of an indeterminate number of elected or selected Indigenous Australians. Starting to get confused now? I've just basically taught you that it's actually, the whole voice is actually 36 voices, not just one voice. It's a very complex and unwieldy system that they're proposing, and that you're going to be voting on the 14th. And the Calma-Langton report makes it very clear that the voices, that the individuals who elect the voices to Parliament, they themselves are not necessarily democratically elected. So what's an example? Say there's a community, and in that community, the people who hold the power are a few elders.
Yeah.
In that community, it may just turn out, even if some people in the community would like a democratic vote, it may just turn out, because of the power of those elders or the power of the power brokers in that community, it might just turn out that they appoint who's going to be on the local regional voice, who appoints the voice to Parliament, or they themselves just appoint themselves.
Yeah.
That is not democracy.
Not.
So this has got to be very clear. This is not a democratic institution. And the problem with that is that means that in our Parliament, which is a democratic institution, you now have a non-democratic institution having direct power within it. And I think in some ways that actually does water down the democratic nature of our Constitution.
Right. Stephen, there's a lot of people in the Aboriginal royalty, in the Aboriginal elite, like Noel Pearson, 550 million since 2005 his organisations have received, and not much to show for it. $40 billion every year, which I recently had an Australian Associated Press fact check on me. Thank you guys for that. Once again, interfering in democracy. They do this every time. I haven't even told you guys this yet. Victorian election, during the election, they wrote a fact check. During pre-poll, it tanked our distribution of our how to vote cards for Turning Point, because we're a third-party campaigner. New South Wales election, they did the same thing. They tried to stop us from getting John Ruddock elected, who thankfully got elected. But these institutions, big tech, which is a topic for another day, are interfering in our democracy. The Australian Associated Press, sounds Australian. Who funds you? An international governmental organisation. Non-governmental organisation, actually. Private corporate entity, since the left used to be against that. Going back to it though, I'm concerned that we might even see a new form of, or even an enhanced gang warfare among Aboriginal tribes for these positions. I mean, we're talking vast sums of money, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you think about what the totality of this voice is supposed to be, which is 36 voices around Australia, and if you were to assume that each representative of the voice would be paid about the same as their parliamentary equivalent, you're talking about a budget for the voice in the hundreds of millions.
Right.
We're talking about very well-paid jobs. And absolutely, that's going to lead to a lot of jockeying for positions. It'll get very, very nasty. I have no doubt about that. And we've seen it all before.
Right.
We saw all of this with ATSIC. I'm old enough to remember ATSIC. It was always embroiled in accusations of scandal and also accusations of really bad criminal activity.
Right.
That it was accused of bullying, corruption, cronyism.
Sexual misconduct?
Rape. Yeah.
Rape? Jesus, wow.
Rape. In fact, one of the members of ATSIC had actually been convicted of raping a minor in the past.
Dear God.
I won't name the name.
Sure.
But it was pretty messy. Now, why wouldn't it be messy when that kind of money and power is at stake?
Right.
And so I could see just a lot of messiness with this as well.
Right. And what would you say to people if they were to say, Australia, you're a white fella, I'm an immigrant, neither of us have a drop of Aboriginal in us. We shouldn't be getting a ballot, we shouldn't be getting a vote on this. Why should we have any kind of say in this?
Well, because this, for a few reasons, but certainly because the kind of power that the advocates of the voice want for this will affect all Australians, because
Right.
they essentially want the ability for the voice to be able to be intimately involved in the making of our laws and laws for everyone at the earliest stages of the legislative process. So when someone decides they want to start crafting a law, at that point, according to the Langton report, the voice needs to be involved, right. and involved all the way through to when that law is finally passed, if it even is passed.
Yep.
So that's really quite dramatically changing our whole legislative process.
Right.
And it's the same for the public service. It's not just a voice to Parliament, it's a voice to the Parliament and the executive.
Right.
Which means that the voice also wants to have, and this is in the Langton report, the ability to be involved in the public service, public policy formulation process right from the beginning, and both the legislative and the legislature and the public service have to sort of in written form justify why they are not going to follow the advice of the voice on policy all the way through, and that's going to stall a lot of policy, and so it affects all Australians. And the other thing is, again, according to the Langton report, the scope of what the voice can talk about is unlimited. Quote, unlimited.
Right.
And so this is something, the nature of our constitution, our legislative system, our public bureaucracy is something that affects all Australians. And so if there's going to be a dramatic change to it,
right.
all Australians must have a say in that.
That's why they should have a vote, right. It certainly sounds like some people are concerned about the communist ties that this has. We know Marcia Langton and her communist ties, and we know that Thomas Mayo, who wrote the Voice book, which details some details about this. People are concerned that this is just a blatant power grab, a blatant money grab. What's the go with this? Is this just a face mask for a communist actual agenda?
Look, I don't think so. I definitely think some of the architects and advocates of the Voice are basically Marxists and right. have communist sympathies. There's right. no doubt in my mind about that. I don't think this could really usher in any kind of sort of nationwide communism in Australia, although what many people have complained about is the inability of many Indigenous Australians to be able to own their own homes because of rules set over them by Indigenous organisations that determine whether they can or cannot buy homes. That's kind of the closest thing you'll get to communism and that kind of thing.
Right.
But certainly, Thomas Mayo, and I think even Teela Reid may have sort of doffed her cap to some communists. I think I'm right about that. And certainly many sort of older activists these days do actually have quite radical Marxist communist pasts. That's absolutely true. I think I think the legacy of that is not so much that it's going to actually lead to any actual communism in Australia, but I think what it's going to do is it's just going to feed basically a hatred of Australia. Right. And I've come to the conclusion, Joel, that actually a lot of the people who advocate for this voice most strongly, most vociferously, and the ones who characterise the No campaign as necessarily racist, I actually think a lot of these people just hate Australia,
right.
and they really want to see sort of the legacy of colonialism unwound, and they want their own separate, sovereign, indigenous state.
Right.
And the Uluru Statement from the Heart makes it very clear that the culmination of this agenda is a treaty. So that's what a voice will be trying to get, a treaty. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart website says that what we want are two sovereignties in Australia. That is what this voice is ultimately about, in my opinion. I don't think it's about closing the gap. I notice that you've got Thomas Mayo's book on the voice. Could you grab
sure.
that? So here we have a 100-page discussion of what the voice is about. And you would think that the most important thing about this voice is about closing the gap, because we don't want to see Indigenous Australians disadvantaged. Well, if that's what you think, you would be wrong, because out of the 100 pages here, only a lousy 5 pages are dedicated to the question of, will this close the gap? Will this actually make Indigenous lives any better? I don't think that that's the main issue with the voice. I think that the voice is really about trying to secure a body in the federal parliament that is constitutionally guaranteed. That can be a tool to try over time to achieve things like a treaty, which is in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and other things that people like Thomas Mayo and Tila Reid and others have spoken about, reparations. I think that is ultimately what this is about, and that's why I actually think Australians are best advised to vote no to this.
Right. I feel like I could talk to you forever, Stephen, but the last question I'll ask is, in my interview with Alec Dumaji, Aboriginal man in Queensland, he made the point that if this voice fails, we need to pursue treaties individually with these particular tribes. Do you have an understanding of the... he was making the point that Australia, when you conquer a people, you're meant to either wipe them out or you're meant to have a treaty with them. Australia is the only place that hasn't happened around the world. I don't know if that claim's correct, but is that a thing? Are you meant to either wipe out the Indigenous population or do a treaty with them of sorts?
Well, we have done... I mean, there are state-based treaties around Australia, so there are actual treaties around here in Australia. Western Australia has one, and there are other sort of treaty commissions that have been instituted in Queensland and Victoria and things like that. So we do have sort of treaties. My opposition to treaties is really grounded in my belief that the most important thing that we need to be talking about is the suffering of Indigenous Australians in the worst affected communities. Right. The women who are being bashed by their husbands, the children who are being sexually abused, and just the men and women who tragically are just living lives of addiction, and just sort of hopelessness. I think that's the issue. And I think if anyone went into these communities, looked around, saw what was going on, and then concluded, right, we really need to recognise these people in the Constitution, or right, we really need a treaty. If that is what you conclude to be the most important thing from seeing what's actually happening in these communities, there is something wrong with you. Right. There is something wrong. So the question always must be, will this help the worst affected Indigenous Australians? A treaty is not going to help any of the worst affected Indigenous Australians at all. It will do nothing to lower the rates of the abuse of women, nothing to lower the rates of the abuse of children. It'll do nothing to increase the rates of school retention among children. It'll do nothing to reduce the rates of alcoholism in Australia. So that's why I think, that's why I'm not in favour of treaties. I'm in favour of figuring out what needs to be done to help those worst affected, and that might mean that the upshot of if this voice referendum fails, and I think it will, I have no doubt that it will actually. 60-40,
60% no,
right
40%
now it's about,
yes?
I'm predicting roughly a 60% no.
Right.
It could be 60 to 65% no, but I am predicting a very, very convincing defeat of the voice. And I think then, at that point, we should start asking, why haven't things gotten better? Given the money that's been spent, why haven't things gotten better? And I think we actually need to use the defeat of the voice to be able to start asking answers and actually doing some audits of some of the very, very well-paid organisations that are supposed to be helping to close the gap which just doesn't seem to be closing.
Right. Well, look, Stephen, you're a wealth of knowledge. As I said, I feel like I could chat to you for another half an hour. But thank you for your time. Where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, Stephen Chavura #1, Stephen Chavura 1. You can find me on TikTok, although TikTok have told me that they've kind of suppressed me for 10 years. So I'm still there, but my numbers are now way down. You can find me, I really want to build up my Telegram pages because I love Telegram. So you can find me on Telegram, Stephen Chavura. And I'm on Facebook as well. I'm here and there.
Awesome. Well, look, Stephen, you've always got a place to chat with us here, and I want to thank you for your wealth of knowledge and illuminating the audience on this. I certainly learnt a lot. Guys, remember to like, share, subscribe, shoot us a couple of bucks for facilitating these discussions. But, Stephen, I want to thank you for your time. God
Thanks
bless
so
you.
much, Joel. Thank you.
you.
Appreciate
Cheers.
it.